seat. Yeah? Are we good? Yes, great. Please take a seat, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for sticking with us, and welcome to this, our final panel for the day. And with this last discussion, we wanted to turn things round a little bit. Arguably, the conversation so far, we talked a lot about Western narcissism, but arguably the conversation maybe is focused a little bit too much on the West, as important as it is to clarify what's going on here. So with this second panel, we wanted to get a sense of developments further away and take a look at how the world is changing in that sense. And this is a very important discussion for me because many of the people that are my friends, or I consider intellectual fellow travelers, people I read and respect their writing, I think they make some very well-founded criticisms, as we've already heard, about the kind of moral incoherence of the West, or the West's kind of culture war rhetoric. And I think that sometimes blinds them, and maybe sometimes they could be a little bit naive about what's going on abroad, because I do think that if you attend closely, as we've already heard from the great example of China, but if you attend closely elsewhere, people in different countries presenting themselves as a civilisational alternative to the West, saying that we believe that there's something very different that they stand for compared to even the traditional ideas of Western civilization that we might want to defend today. So I think it's very important that we get a clear and level-headed view of the developments abroad. And that also means asking a few questions about the narrative that we're told in terms of a new world order emerging to challenge the West. We know at one level that's true, but I think also it can be quite overstated. So we wanted to take stock, figure out what developments really are shifting tectonically in the makeup of global civilization, and try and figure out how to chart a course for the West in the midst of this. So to help us through that, we've got four wonderful speakers, writers, thinkers, contributors to the questions that we need to dig into. So I'll introduce them briefly, and then we'll hear from them, and then we'll open up for the discussion. So first, we'll hear from Monica Gabriela Bartoszewicz, who's an associate professor in societal security and safety at UiT Arctic University, Norway. She's also, in addition to being a great writer and interesting academic, but has been a bit of a friend of ours here at MCC Brussels, and has, at major points when we've had to sit down and reflect about what's going on, we've been delighted to count on her to come and speak our event. So delighted she's back. Next, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Anton Bernaczewski, who's the director of Oculus Economics Research Forum. Lots of interesting work trying to get to grips with the way that the world order is changing. Next, we're going to hear from Nicolo Soldo. He's a writer and commentator, author of a really important Substack. I'm too well brought up and British to pronounce or say the name of his Substack, so I won't, but you can see it. But despite the potty-mouthed name, he's actually a really serious thinker and someone who's contributed a lot to my thinking and writing on topics related to geopolitics. So delighted he's here. And then last but by no means least, we got Krzysztof Tycka-Trodowski, who's another writer and geopolitical analyst whose writings have really helped me figure out what's changing and shifting in the world order. So we've got a great panel. We've got a lot on the table to get into. So without any further ado, Monica, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So perhaps Frank broke into Ralph's room to read his speech, but I am sure that Ralph actually hacked into my computer and read my speech. Ralph, did you? I also partially think that maybe I should join the previous panel, because many of the themes that we've been discussing today are recurring ones. So maybe I'll just set the stage for the gentleman here, being the token female. I noticed that. But I wanted to talk about three things: the West and the rest, the values versus val-EUs, which are two different things, and then very briefly about the role of culture in geopolitics, so just to set us off. We'll start by I wanted to start with something that we talked about already, that the dynamic of clashing values and growing cultural divide so visible in the emerging geopolitical constellations shows that the Western-inspired moment of universalism has passed. And the geopolitical momentum results from challenging the liberal privilege based on the universalist assumption that all societies and cultures can exist within its embrace. And the EU specifically is in a very precarious position here because it created a space of moral liberal order, an order that is not being revealed, that is now being revealed as not universal. In this sense, EU, but not Europe, I wanted to emphasize that, presents what Bruno Macias, a Portuguese politician and academic, defines as a civilization state, a state or a group of states that is organized around culture rather than politics. This reasoning echoes, of course, Christopher Coker's reflections on how different governments and movements are using the currency of civilization to their own political ends. Coker claimed that we live in a world in which civilization is fast becoming the currency in international politics, as, I quote here, the language of civilization has allowed politicians to prioritize battles to be fought in the future. Accordingly, the task of protecting specific cultural tradition becomes paramount where that culture is dominant. So Macias argues that EU is becoming reconfigured as a civilizational state, but we see how this notion of European as universal is being challenged internationally. What we see is that the various states show an increasing conviction that they have their own way of organizing their societies, political systems, and economic affairs. And they also say that measuring them with a yardstick that to a large extent is seen as a cultural import is a bland ally. Now, this brings us to the question of values. Civilization and culture that we talk about so much today, we really did not define at all. So I wanted to explain how I see things here, and I see civilization as an expression defining the development of the state and the civic collective life. And it is just like a very famous Polish academic defined it before the Second World War, a method of organizing the collective life. And for me, this is the key word here, method. Civilization is a method, the way that we organize ourselves. And this is the reason why you immediately see you cannot be civilized in two ways. You can't blend civilizations. There's only one way you can do it. Now, as the fruit of human inspirations and efforts that Bill was talking so nicely about, it always, willingly or unwillingly, becomes a career of spiritual symbolic content, influencing everyday experiences and human choices, and thus it is precisely culture and civilization that gives dynamic to history, to politics, to everything that happens in the world. It is so because values shape societal life. The belief that the most serious challenge facing civilization in the West, in its inevitable clash with other cultures, especially with Islam, has been repeatedly voiced in the last 2 decades or so, and threats and problems with the integration of migrant minorities that we discussed in a previous panel only seemed to confirm that diagnosis. But I do agree with something that appeared with within the first panel, that we observed a clash within a civilization, and it echoes what Benjamin Barber was writing about in his seminal book that is placed at the heart of our culture, is that the cultural resources of Europe, which for centuries were presented to the world as universal civilizational model, are now attacked from without and from within by those who are insisting that they are actually the vanguard and the truest and most progressive representatives of what we understand as Western civilization. And how we got here is very important to me, because I don't think we also understand the dynamic. When we say the collective woke, what does it mean? I think it's very critical for us to understand the process that allowed for us to happen to be in this precise place, because we are not dealing with the Gramscians. The first generation Gramscians, they marched through the institutions, they took over them, they hated Europe, they hated its history and everything it stands for. And to understand what it is like, it's not even enough to read Gramsci, you just need to look into the Hungarian Georgi Lucas and what he did or tried to achieve in Hungary. But then we had the second generation of Gramscians who already arrived at these institutions that were took over. These were not barbarians, these were sleek barbarians, affluent people who were brought up within that environment. They were educated, they were fueled also by an unwavering belief that they are blazing the trail of progress. Modern day Huns, we could call them. They presented themselves as the natural successor of the Western tradition, but the subversion was already done through radical re-evaluation and redefinition of meaning, because war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and all the rest is disinformation. Now, they have subverted the essence of European values, and they become European values, didn't they? That supplanted, this subversion means that we use the same labels like family or democracy, but the meaning is obviously entirely different. But by doing so, and this is important for our conversation here, they also eroded the whole fundamental of something that we used to call the normative power Europe. Why? Because if you hate everything that made Europe, then why would anyone else respect this? So let me move on, because what now we are dealing with is the third generation Gramscians. They hate the West, but they genuinely do not know it. Because what they think it is all the isms, racism, colonialisms, all the phobias that you can cram into political discourse and nothing else. And someone mentioned Haidt earlier on. Epistemic institutions only reinforce that belief and that knowledge. And if you want to check that if it's true, it's enough to Google anything or go to Wikipedia and it will tell you so. So they will say there is nothing like the European culture, but multiculturalism is our strength. But it's also a punishment for all the sins of the past. And so you cannot be proud of what your ancestors did, but you should definitely feel guilty for them doing all sorts of bad things. That's the essence of what we have now, what is now our offer and message to the world, from Europe definitely, but from the West in general. So third generation Gramscians have been so deracinated by liberal progressivism, they don't have a collective identity anymore. They are looking for one, and they find it, yes, of course, but they find it in other cultures and in other value systems, because they believe them to be both better and more righteous than the one they come from and they were taught to hate. So when Samuel Huntington first introduced the clash of civilisations in 1991, he said that cultural conflict was inevitable, and his argument was built on the idea that the Western world was simultaneously at its zenith of power and the peak of hatred towards it. Now, since then, the hatred only increased, but our power goes down, and this is important for us to remember. So the West is grappling with something that I would call just an autoimmunological disease. And like with all autoimmune diseases, this phenomenon is marked by body's defense system, the culture in this case, turning against itself, attacking the very society that fostered it. And these dynamics converge and are perhaps best captured by how mass migration internally is being ridiculed as conspiracy theory of grand replacement. I'm sure you've heard that. But at the same time, externally lauded as a form of retributive justice, because we do deserve it as a reverse colonization. And if you're not proud of your own culture, if you despise your own civilization, how can you expect that anyone else will respect it and adopt its axiology into their own? Why would you expect that this the method that you organized your society is going to be the organizing principle of the international order. I'm maybe not as optimistic as Ralph is. I'm not really that pessimistic either, because I believe that we do take European culture for granted, since we do not know how bad its absence is. And we will never realize how much it's there until it's gone. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for the invitation from Matthias Korvin's Collegium. I'm very happy to be here. I'm from Hungary. I live in Hungary, but I lived in Minsk, so I have Belarusian, Polish origin. I lead a think tank in Hungary, Economus. We are dealing with economics and geopolitics. And at the same time, I'm writing articles and analytical pieces in the Hungarian media. And I'm dealing with the post-Soviet countries, so that's my main areas of expertise. So my approach will be more geopolitical, foreign political in the topic. So, well, clearly what we see now is a crisis in international system. In the recent years, the world has been hit by a series of crises, starting from terrorist attacks to global pandemic, Russian aggression, conflict in the Middle East, trade and sanction wars. And Professor Füredi mentioned in the morning that he's quite pessimistic. He's kind of worried about the situation now with the situation in the Russian-Ukrainian war. I'm not worried yet, but I think we are about to enter a much more turbulent period of time. So I think the next decade will be much worse than we've seen so far. At the same time, I think I'll be more optimistic by the end of my presentation. So what are the universal Western values? Democracy, individualism, free market, rationalism, equality, human rights. These values used to work during the Cold War, right? Why they're not working now? Well, because the West lost its credibility. It lost the right to be the example maker, the right to provide justice, to be followed. And where did it start? It started after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We became lazy at one time. At the same time, Fukuyama, it was mentioned several times during the day. So it continued with Fukuyama thoughts, and it's quite amazing how a political scientist could be so influential to define our foreign policy and our thinking for decades. Quite interesting. So the Western policymakers have bought into Fukuyama's naive notion of the end of human history and the triumph of democracies. Then it continued with neoconservatives during the 2000s. The West has broken its own rules. The ideas of American exceptionalism, the neoconservatives believe that in the unique role of the US as global leader and champion of democracy, the rule maker, the big policeman. And support for democratic promotion. So it also started from Fukuyama, right? If we believe that democratic countries do not fight with each other, so what we have to do, we create democracies everywhere. And if we force democracy on other countries, we won't fight them because there will be no more wars anymore. So it will be some kind of an ideal world. So the United States and in that period of time basically broke the rules which were defined previously, like promotion of democracy, but at the same time partnering with the countries which are quite far from being democratic, right, like Saudi Arabia. Support for trade, free trade and market economies, but at the same time imposing trade barriers and sanctions and restrictions when it's not aligned with US interests. Or multilateral multilateralism and being involved in international institutions, but not involving emerging countries into those institutions when they pose some kind of threat. And then it continued. It became much worse after the Obama administration. Cosmopolitanism, weakness, very damaging reactions on foreign political events. We've seen the first war between the post-Soviet countries in 2008. Okay, it was not the time of Obama, but right after came the war between Georgia and Russia. And what was his reaction? Reset. We need a big red button, restart our relationship with Russia, and everything will be fine. Everybody will be happy, right? We just start from blank paper, and then we reestablish our relationship with Russia. It didn't work because the West projected only weakness, not power. The same goes for Crimea, 2014, when Russia seized Crimea. What was the Western action? Basically nothing. Some sanctions, but nothing in particular. Then Russian intervention in Syria, 2017. So all of these were clearly seen as a sign of weakness by the world's emerging, growing, and highly ambitious countries. And these countries felt that right now is the time to change the Western dominance. That's how we got here, where we are now, in international relations. So rules-based order is no more, if it even existed. Can we speak about new world order or the change of the world order? Well, change in the new world order means that we have to substitute the current world order with something else. And what could be that something else? We see emerging powers, China, Russia, Iran, India, Brazil. We could speak, and a lot of people speaking now about BRICS. I'm pretty skeptic about BRICS, but I will talk about BRICS a bit later. So what these competitors want? How many minutes do you have? 5. Oh, fantastic. Do they want to break the current system? Well, those which are not part of the system, they do want to break it, like Iran, North Korea. But ask Russia if it wants to transform United Nations and if it wants to enlarge Security Council and maybe involve its partners, Brazil, India, into the Security Council. No, it won't change it, right? Ask Moscow how desperately they wanted to join the World Trade Organization back in the time, 15 years ago. So let's continue with BRICS. We are talking about BRICS as some kind of anti-Western bloc, which threatens the Western dominance, the position of the West. BRICS is started as a promise of emerging countries to reach the level of developed countries back in 2001. It was introduced by a British economist working for Goldman Sachs. So basically what he said, that there is a bunch of countries which have very promising dynamics, which could be the leaders, or which could reach the level of the current leaders of the world. So we have to watch carefully for those countries. Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then South Africa joined. So that we have to invest in those countries, we have to build relationship with those countries because, well, they are quite promising countries, right? And then after that, in 2006, the BRICS was created, formalized. It started as a promise of emerging countries to reach the level of developed world back in 2001, but it's still a promise. So they're not even close to reach, except for China. China is in a different situation, but all of the countries which are in the BRICS right now, or were at the beginning, their share in the economy are quite comparable to their share 2 decades ago. And now the promise has changed. What we see now, the BRICS was enlarged last year. 4 more countries joined, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran. And it's not about a promise of becoming developed, rich countries anymore, because if they wanted to integrate those kind of countries in the BRICS, then we would be talking about Nigeria, we would be talking about Indonesia. But what unites these countries right now is a massive anti-Western emotions. So it moved to being an anti-Western alliance formed by Russia and China, and this is the only thing which unites those countries. So they do not have, well, all of the countries have proper trade with China, but well, most of the countries in the world do have that. But among the rest of the members, they do not have proper trade relations. They have very deep conflicts between them. Just imagine Iran versus Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, India versus China, Egypt versus Ethiopia. There are big conflicts, disputes in the background. No institution, the only institution BRICS has is an annual forum, which they hold every year. And basically, that's it. I'm closing to the finish. So when we are talking about the rest confronting the West, then what is the alternative? Besides the anti-Western narrative which some countries present in international relations, what is the ideology? Ideology of imperialism. You know, Russia recently closed the last museum of Gulag in Moscow. It was a process they started back in 2014. Renaming one of the museum in Perm, Gulag Museum, it became Museum of Gulag Workers. So they're showing clear continuity from the Soviet system to the current system. Like you can see that modern Russia clearly defines itself as a country which inherits from the previous system. So we can talk about imperialism, Pan-Slavism, Eurasianism. Are these the values which could define an anti-Western alliance or an alternative against the West? I'm not sure. And the positive remarks, well, the West has to renew, adapt, address the problems and challenges, and looking back on the last several centuries of Western world and abilities to adapt, I'm more than positive that we are able to do so. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone from the MCC for inviting me back here. I was part of their first, was it, 2 years ago, at the library in the EU? Not the first. So thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Frank. The problem with being the second last person speaking on the day is that 90% of the material that you wanted to cover has already been covered. And I don't want to bore everybody here by repeating myself, repeating what's already been said. So I'm going to keep this very brief so that we can get closer to the most interesting part, which is where we field questions from the audience. With that in mind, I would like to start in the following way. In 1980, there's a documentary called The Decline and Fall of Western Civilization by Penelope Spheris. This was not a movie about history or civilization, a documentary, sorry. It was a documentary about punk rock in Southern California. And there was one incredibly interesting character in that movie, a French punk rock journalist named Kickboy Face. During his segment, he opened it up by saying the following: I have some good news for the world. There is no such thing as new wave. I want to say something similar by paraphrasing what he said and announced that there is good news for the world. There is no such thing as multipolarity as it exists today, with the added caveat that it also might be bad news. So I want us all to step back here for a second and take a look at the world as it stands now, specifically Europe and its place in it, which is really what we're discussing here. Europe's place in the world and where we're going from here. Next year, we're going to be either commemorating or celebrating or lamenting 80 years since the end of the Second World War. The conflict that has given us the basis for our entire post-world order. 80 years of, and don't take this the wrong way, but it's been 80 years of occupation. Now, one half of that occupation fell off when the Berlin Wall was taken down in 1989, and the Soviets went home. We still have the Americans on our soil, and when you look at it objectively, it is, for all intents and purposes, an occupation. It is nowhere near as, let's say, heavy-handed as the Soviet one was, and there are some positive elements to it too, if you want to be fair. But at the end of the day, it is an occupation. It's an occupation that was built on the fallout of two brutal European civil wars from which our continent has yet to recover from. We have gone through several epochs of history since the beginning of that occupation, and we are now at a point where Europe has been technically united for 3 decades now since Maastricht, but it's flailing around looking for an actual purpose, or let's say a purpose that the people can get behind on how to tackle what's going to go and how we're going to move forward from here on in. So there's some good news and there's some bad news. There are some worries and there are some, more importantly in my opinion, opportunities from this current environment. Multipolarity is not a condition that can best describe the world right now. Here is why. The United States is still by far the preeminent global power. It's a hegemon. When you look at its competitors, revisionist states, whether it be Russia, China, or let's say Iran, there have been moves, of course, which Anton touched upon, especially with regarding to BRICS or organizations like this SCO, to create institutions that would rival what the West has. But when you look at it today, where is the competitor to the IMF? Where is the competitor to the World Bank? Where is their version of NATO? None of these things exist as it stands today. And it's going to take a lot of time before these revisionist powers are able to cobble together anything remotely resembling what exists here in the West today, that we're governed by. For example, here's my favorite example to use. The New Development Bank, AKA the BRICS Bank. There has been a lot of wish casting whereby this would turn into something equivalent to the World Bank. The NDB today, as it stands, is party to the sanctions regime against Russia. This is a case out of necessity. So they are aligned with the United States-led Western sanctions regime against Russia. That is not a very good start for a competitor to make. Second of all, there has been a lot of sensationalism attached to BRICS as well. There was calls for a BRICS currency. That's not happening. There have been calls even for the setup of a rival payment system to SWIFT by BRICS. Vladimir Putin, a few weeks ago in Kazan at the BRICS summit, said that's not happening either. So even though there is a reaction to a lot of the overreach led by the United States and the Western system on the part of these countries, there is a certain level of realism that some of these countries do have, in that the system that has arisen out of post-World War II order, Bretton Woods, et cetera, is so ingrained, so intricate, so integrated, and it's so difficult to manage and swim through. That's going to take a lot of time and effort in order to be able to challenge this existing system and the structures that have arisen from it. And saying that, you have to even figure that, are they going to be as this aligned 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road? With NATO and the EU, there's a lot more discipline that the United States can, I'd say, practice with its allies for economic, ideological reasons, legacy reasons, et cetera. With BRICS and other supposed challengers like the SCO, it's almost like herding cats. You need policy alignment in order to challenge something like the U.S. greenback, which is still something like 89% of all trade in currencies is still conducted through the US dollar, if you factor in both sides. Second place is the euro, by the way. The Chinese renminbi is less than 4%, I think, at present. But the point that I'm trying to make is that policy alignment between countries like Russia, China, India, et cetera, is almost impossible to imagine, much less implement. So the United States is not going anywhere for the present time. The victory of Donald Trump is not a revolution either. It's more of a reversion to the mean. It actually entrenches liberalism in the classic sense, as opposed to the progressive sense that we have seen color the United States in the last 15, 20 years. So the Americans are here to stay, despite all the social experimentation that they've conducted over the last 15 years, let's say since the beginning of the Obama era. And 2 years ago, when I was first at MCC, there was a lovely American fellow named John from Cleveland, neocon at heart, absolute total neocon. And him and I came to the agreement that the United States has roughly about a 20-year head start on any potential competitors, which allows them to engage in this type of social experimentation, which we look at from an objective view and think, why are they doing this? Why are they introducing DEI? It just seems naturally that it's going to harm their interests. But they have a 20-year head start on all their competitors. And with Trump's victory now, you have the example of this gentleman from Fox News who has been nominated to head the Department of Defense. The reason why is he is going to, if he passes the nomination process, he is going to be tasked with removing all DEI from the entire armed force of the United States, because they've come to the decision that enough's enough. This is affecting our ability to conduct military operations around the globe. Saying this, the victory of Trump is not 100% positive for Europe, but there is a lot of positivity to be gained from it. In my opinion, the biggest positive from it and the biggest opportunity for Europe and for forces from Europe who are more national focused, let's say Viktor Orban's Community of Nations idea, as opposed to the Brussels bureaucracy that's existing at present, is that Trump's victory basically takes away mom and dad from the Brussels bureaucrats. They lose legitimacy with respect to the type of progressive liberalism that they have tried to export globally and that they have solidified into policy at the State Department. So Brussels and various national leaders that are aligned with Brussels, they are now flailing about trying to understand why this happened and how do they recover from this, because this victory by Trump has opened the doors up to populist forces in Europe and allowed them to gain more ground on this continent. I think we'll stop from there for now, and we'll move on to the next one. How's that sound?
I'm Krzysztof Tyszka-Drozdowski, and thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be among those terrific people, really great folks. So the team here is the West, but I will focus my remarks on Europe, and I will focus on internal causes of our European geopolitical decline. In my view, there are four realities that we must confront if we hope for a glimmer of lucidity in debate around Europe. First is the exhaustion of both right and left and the performative character of European politics. Second is so-called European providerism. Third would be the idea of EU as regulatory superpower, or in the parlance of Karl Marx, the false consciousness of EU's bureaucrats. And the fourth, the liberal gerontocracy, the rule of the old as the political system prevailing on the continent. I will start from the first reality. So the EU has stripped member states of much of their sovereignty. They can't impose their tariffs. They can't create any meaningful form of industrial policy. In the case of the Eurozone, the monetary policy is no longer decided in their capitals, but in Frankfurt. European political elites now perform what French thinker Emmanuel Todd calls la grande comédie, the great comedy. They are concerned with putting on a spectacle, concealing from the voters that they lost the ability to act in any meaningful way in the face of their economic sovereignty being taken away. So today's progressive left primarily offers a moralistic justification of status quo in the absence of any material improvement, which it appears incapable of and uninterested in delivering. Today's right, on the other hand, tends toward rebellion against the dominant progressive culture, mores, and institutions as an end in itself. I would say that across the ideological spectrum, then there's little room for serious statesmanship. Now, let's shift to the second reality that we must confront, what I call providerism. Europe is the continent of consumption. This is ironic because we like to call out Americans as, consumerist society. But while America may be consumerist at the micro level, it is highly productive at the macro level. The US still makes tons of good stuff, from medicine to scientific research, to technology, to space travel. Americans are leading the charge. And Europe, on the other hand, is a macro consumer. Virtually everything of value that we have here comes from elsewhere. I call this providerism, the ability to ignore political economic reality because everything is provided for you, and the underlying mechanics and costs are abstracted away. Obvious examples are the outsourcing of security and software to the US. Less obvious one may be the fact that the Green New Deal agenda, this European flagship project, is provided by China. China is by far the biggest supplier of many of the key building blocks for clean technologies. It's responsible for the production of about 90% of the world's rare earth elements, at least 80% of all stages of making solar panels, and 60% of wind turbines and electric car batteries. In some of the materials used in batteries, China's market share is close to 100%. So what's the economic picture emerging from this providerist era in Europe? Consider this. At the summit held in Lisbon in March 2000, the heads of state and European Council announced extremely ambitious objectives, including the surpassing of the US economy by 2010. These projections, as you may have figured out, were delusional. The Eurozone economy grew about 6% over the past 15 years, measured in dollars, compared with 82% for the US. That has left the average EU country poorer per capita than every American state except Idaho and Mississippi. Now, to the idea of regulatory empire. This is a very revealing idea, and it was introduced in a book by Anu Bradford called Brussels Effect. The European elites, the elites that are sitting in Brussels, they perceive this idea of Europe as a regulatory superpower as a way to compensate for European decline in every other area. Brussels may not be able to jumpstart innovation, stop the wave of populism, stop terrorism, or transform EU into military power, but it can regulate and impose its regulations on the world. The core of the argument is that EU is an indispensable market. As a global market, Europe is not as big as it used to be, however. And if you take a look, for example, at Apple's financial statements by geography, Europe accounts for 25% of global revenue. But in Apple's consolidation, Europe includes the UK, Norway, Russia, Turkey, and the entire Middle East. None of them are EU members. In fact, the EU accounts for only 7% of Apple's global revenue. So at some point, it's just all too cumbersome, and the big firms are going to play hardball with Europe. This will have significant consequences, for example, in the domain of AI. We may see the EU and the US technology markets bifurcate, similar to how automobile markets have separated. Cars are widespread in Latin America, but the models are overwhelmingly older, less safe, and less fuel efficient than the ones that we have in EU and in the US. The same could happen with artificial intelligence. Now, the last reality that I want to talk about is liberal gerontocracy. Never before has the Europe been so old, with elderly wielding unprecedented influence. Many European states have become fictions through which one generation lives at the expense of the young. Let's take France as an example, where the logic of the welfare state has been reversed. Redistribution goes not from the rich to the poor, but in the opposite direction. The French National Statistics Institute reports that of all age groups, those over 65 are the least at risk of poverty, while those under 30 are the most. Assets accumulated by the old are only increasing in their value, while for the young it's harder and harder to buy a home and start a family. On average, between 2015 and 2023, house prices rose by 50% in Europe. The old are the biggest electorate. This explains, for instance, why there is so little investment in new infrastructure. Long-term projects are at odds with political party focus on short-term interest, that is catering to the largest slice of the electorate, the gerontocratic one, for whom the distant future holds little concern. One trait that has atrophied the most in Europe, in my view, compared to the rest of the world, is the willingness to take risk. History teaches us that societies facing decline must gamble on new ideas. Yet Europe's regulatory obsession and risk-averse gerontocracy prevent such boldness. Member states, constrained by EU policies, cannot chart their own paths to recovery. The result is a continent paralyzed by caution and unable to respond to its diminishing position in the global order.
Thanks, very, very good. I'm particularly keen to get out to the audience as quickly as I can. I'm not giving you a chance to maybe start formulating some questions, but we'll get the microphones. We've only got about half an hour for the discussion, so we've got one microphone here. Can we get that round to the middle, please? No? Okay, you've given it to someone else. Okay, that's fine. Go ahead. And then where's the other microphone? Yeah, could you get it to that gentleman in the back? We'll hear from you and then from you. Yeah. The first from you.
Okay,
yeah,
very good. Hi, so I want to thank you all very much for speaking. My question is directed towards Niccolo Soldo, because you put forward a few years ago the idea of Turbo America, which was a counter-narrative to the more long-running narrative of American decline and eventual American collapse and retreat, which is that America's not going to go anywhere and probably in some respects will even get stronger. What I want to know is, while you lay out a very clear case geopolitically why America will probably in all likelihood, will stay in Europe and not go anywhere, how do you see Turbo America and Europe's relationship being reflected in economics? Because it does seem to me that America wants to onshore, but Europe wants to onshore. So how is this reconciled with the continued geopolitical presence of America in Europe?
Okay, good. Let's get a few more, and we'll get a
thank you.
little bit on the table.
Pierre-Emmanuel Thoman. I teach geopolitics in France and Eurocontinent in Brussels. My question is about the notion of a West. Actually, now it means NATO countries dominated by United States. But they have their own geopolitical agenda, which is to cut any cooperation on the Eurasian axis, Paris, Berlin, Moscow. And in terms of coming back, securing of European civilization, because I think we should talk about Europe and not the West, because it's a notion of the Cold War, of the past. We should reconnect with Russia. And because this is a conservative pole in Europe, the only sovereign one, which could counterbalance the United States. And I think it's what is going to happen in the future. Russia has won the war. And the problem is they wanted in Ukraine to westernize. It means Americanize Ukraine. It didn't work, and I think it's a good news that it didn't work, because NATO and EU are a tool of colonization of the West and Europe, and we need to get away from it and recognize on the axis of nation states on balance of power, as General de Gaulle wanted, to come back to our European civilization. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We'll hear from this gentleman at the front. No.
Yeah, so Richard Schenk from MCC Brussels, and until a few months ago, I would have subscribed to the idea that BRICS is a constellation of nations that is struggling to develop any positive vision for the future or any further integration. But because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we have a kind of a field test what happens when the West is in an open conflict with one of the BRICS members. And newest data show that the Russian economy has shifted completely towards the other BRICS members to a degree that it is like if Russia would have entered in a free trade agreement with the other BRICS members. So the statistical effect is almost the same. So because BRICS is kind of like a safety net, obviously, for the member states that are in this association, is open conflict with one of the BRICS members even an option for the West?
Great, thanks. We'll take one more. There's this gentleman here in the middle. Yeah, and then we'll get the panel back for a few reflections.
First of all, thank you for your speeches. I have a question for Mr. Soldo and Mr. Drozdowski. So multipolarity maybe is indeed further away than some people would claim, but in my view, the vector is pointed in that direction. So my question is, shouldn't Europe right now start to form an independent pole in that emerging multipolar world, also in regards to its independence of foreign industries, its, in your words, the occupation of Europe by the United States, your own words, because, in my dictionary, nationalism means first and foremost sovereignty. And I think that that's the big problem that we are facing now in Europe, that we lack real sovereignty economically and geopolitically as well. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Lots on the table. Monica, pick up on something from the questions or maybe reflect on some of the other speeches from
I will maybe just only reply to this very provocative proposition to reunite with Russia as a beacon of conservatism. Sir, I'm not speaking as a Pole. Putting my complex history with that country aside, Russia is not Europe, with all due respect. It is simply not. It comes from a different civilisational tradition. And again, I do understand civilization as a method of organizing collective life, where law trumps ethics, which comes exactly from a different place. It's just not simply possible. And even if you take every single metric that we tend to use by measuring whether or not something is conservative, divorce rate, abortion, alcoholism, you name it, Russia will be more corrupt than the most corrupt Europe there. And just because they are opposing LGBT agenda does not make them conservative. I know, I can see you laughing, but really, what does it mean to be conservative then? What do you want to conserve? Of course, I do agree with your second point. Obviously, we should restore the idea of cultural Europe, definitely. West is an outdated concept. I agree 100% here. But to do this, we would have to overcome another very difficult heritage, and that is a heritage of 1789. And we are unable to do it in Europe at present. So I don't really see an easy fix here. We are outsourcing our security in Europe to the US because our security depends on them. And Nicola said, we are also outsourcing our political momentum to them because now we are like, yes, Trump won, there is chance for us. I don't see any autonomy at the moment in Europe, precisely because we are unable to discuss what was it that made Europe European. The answer to this is
very unpopular, actually, because we would have to revisit Christianity, and nobody wants to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. No. Anton.
I couldn't agree more what you told on Russia. I'm on the same page. But I start from different approach, talking about NATO and NATO expansion, as Russia framed it, a threat against Russia, the war in Ukraine, answer on NATO's expansion. Well, we are those countries, Poland, Hungary, which became part of the NATO in the last decades. And it was not a decision which was enforced on those countries, but it was a decision, the only possible decision which was made by the countries' democratically elected governments to make sure they are secure. And Russia, which defined the history of the region in the last few hundred years, and oppressed, suppressed, occupied, would not come back. That was the only possible choice after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was weakened. And well, I think those people who understood Russia, they would predict that Russia would return, because Russia is going on the same cycles. It's strengthening, then becomes the cycle of enlargement and expansion, and then it collapses. And then again, it's a cycle of become a strengthening. What the collapse was the Soviet Union, 2000s was about strengthening. And then now we are in a cycle of expansion. So those people who know Russia and seen the cycle, Russia is weak in the 90s, that was the only window of opportunity for our countries to join the NATO and make sure we are secure. Poland, Hungary, the whole of Central Europe, the Baltic countries, we joined in the right time. Unfortunately for Ukraine, they could not join, so they couldn't secure their defense, because the only alliance which could defend them from Russia was NATO. So it was an absolutely natural choice of those countries. It was not something which was enforced or whatever. I don't see the opportunity now to reconnect with Russia until they have the same vision and the same, there was no, I don't know, re-envisioning, returning to the past like Germany had after the Second World War. Russia is, well, it's absolutely all right with the imperial past, with Stalin. Stalin is the most popular leader in Russia after Putin, of course, but...
okay. Yeah, well, we'll leave that there. Nick?
Okay, I'm going to answer his question first with respect to the economic outlook of the Trump victory and how that relates to my concept of Turbo America. One-line explanation of Turbo America is that America is now aggressively pursuing hegemony despite the challenges that have come up in that. And what makes it turbo is that they're trying to do it all simultaneously, and that relates specifically to both Russia and China. The Americans are indicating their desire to leave the mess that they created in Ukraine, and it is their mess, by the way, on the plate of Europe, so that the Europeans have to manage that while they go to China and try to either contain it or neutralize it or whatever. Now, with respect to the economic outlook, this is one of the points where I think that this is a negative. Trump's foreign policy is going to be transactional. He's going to at least try to pursue it in that fashion. And during lunch, I was talking to two Dutch gentlemen, and I was discussing with them the company ASML, which does lithography for silicon chips out in East Asia, in Taiwan, and specifically in China. It's probably Europe's most important company when it comes to tech. The Americans under Biden, and this is going to continue with Trump, by the way, is they pressured them to reduce the amount of business that they're doing with the Chinese, because this is such a critical key component in the global supply chain. But at the same time, they told Dutch, by the way, we're going to start subsidizing our own companies in the United States to compete with you. So that's the outlook economically. Economic subservience to the United States, to the point where we are still a market for what little they produce, but with a much reduced scope for our own economic autonomy, unless we get our proverbial excuse my language, shit together.
Thanks, Nick. Christoph.
Yeah, I would like to respond to a question from Serdar. Yeah, I think that in order for us in Europe to be competitive, first of all, we have to ease the regulatory burden. But it's very difficult to imagine that this will come to pass, as this is their bread and butter, right? Those regulations. All those lawyers, all those pencil pushers, that's their livelihood, right?
Bottle cap.
Yeah, and there are like thousands of them, in the sea. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the concept of so-called strategic autonomy that is pushed by the French. Germans are reluctant. So there are like I envision two ways one, we need to have strategic autonomy, we have to have a serious industrial policy. And to have this, the first option is Germans are going to pay for it, but they're not willing. And the second option is to cut the subsidies for French agriculture, and that's not going to happen either. So France has only those two options. One is German hegemony, they're reluctant, and the other is suicide. So I think that we're in a tough place.
If I can add something about strategic autonomy just for 1 second. French ex-diplomat Gérard Araud, he mentioned to me how the French have sought, actually, responses from European partners with respect to pursuing strategic autonomy. And he told me that when they go to capitals like Tallinn, Warsaw especially, they say, no, we prefer the American shield. So if the Europeans, if a good segment of Europeans are interested in strategic autonomy, it becomes a non-starter until it becomes actually necessary. And I still think we're far distant from that point.
Great, thanks. Let's get a few more.
There was a question on BRICS.
Okay, very quick.
Yeah, but we didn't answer it.
Well, we can't answer everything, but if you can have a sentence if you want.
A bit more, but yeah, Russia and the BRICS SafeNet. Well, I think it's a really one-way relations, and as I mentioned in my speech, I think BRICS, as it is a not existing structure because it doesn't have any formal institutions and anything. In terms of security, military relations, there are different organizations operated by Russia, like Eurasian Economic Union, ODKB, I don't know what's the English, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with China. But BRICS doesn't serve something to substitute the West or the Western relations. Simply, Russia is now trying to sell to those countries their energy sources, which are willing to buy it because it's much cheaper, like 20, 25, 30% cheaper. But then we're not talking about creating something like a nexus between those countries, creating something new products. We are talking about bringing Western products through those countries to Russia, right? It's not about substituting, creating something. It's about avoiding the direct roads through China, India, Turkey. And actually, there is one example.
Go on, one example, and then we'll go back.
Because you asked what will happen if the BRICS countries confront. There was no such example yet, but there is similar example where Armenia and Azerbaijan had clashes, but one is part of Russian military organization, ODKB. The other is aspiring member for BRICS, Azerbaijan. They are candidate. And Russia did not help Armenia. It was their partner. It was part of the military organization. They asked for help during the Karabakh conflict, and Russia did not provide it. So Armenia now are searching for alternative from this union, from these relations. Okay. And
Yeah, no, good. There's plenty on the table. We'll come out for some more questions and comments. So yeah, there's a gentleman there, then there's two more people on this side. So yeah, Philip, if you could get to the front. But firstly, you, yeah.
Hello. Question. My name is Marx. Question for Nicolo and also Christoph. You mentioned, well, the political cultural landslide with the Trump election, the second one a couple of weeks ago. It did happen in a democracy. The democracy, there was choice, and the people voted. That is because there is a democracy, and that is because there is a people. There is an American demos. There's no such thing in Europe. There are demoi, there are peoples, democracies. Still, the adversary is the same. The deep state, the blob across the Atlantic, and here's something, EU technocracy, the high state, whatever. The similarities are plentiful. Question, how can we still learn, whether you want to hang on to the West as a concept or not? The similarities are still plentiful. How do we learn what worked in the US, and how can we have the same thing against our common adversary?
Great, thanks, nice point. There's a gentleman, has someone got the next question? Yeah, this person at the front, and then there's someone else down there.
Yeah, hi. With all respect to everybody who's formerly was under the control of the previous Soviet Union and so forth, I just want to say the narrative between Russia good, Ukraine good, Russia bad is a bit simplistic. I think it's very simplistic because it's a very complex situation. I have no love for Russia because my wife is Armenian and the CSTO failed Armenia at its most vital moment. However, I do think that we need to look at this objectively with empirical evidence. If we look back to 16 to 28 October 1968, the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is never looked at. I mean, Russia wanted to, the Soviet Union at the time, wanted to plant nuclear missiles in Cuba. Kennedy took a hardline stance against it. How is that any different from NATO planting missiles in Romania, in Poland, and in potentially in Ukraine as well? That's what my question is.
Thanks. All right. There's someone else there with the microphone. Yeah, thanks.
I'm essentially thinking out loud here, but you mentioned that the US is 20 years ahead of Europe in every respect. Now, as a lawyer, we're taught that in terms of persuasion, persuading a judge is like moving a tanker. It takes a long time, a lot of thoughtful, tactful maneuvers. In order to, I think, turn the tanker away from the US, maybe we have to realize that in the history of Europe, including the UK, we've built alliances with the world. That includes the Commonwealth, it includes Asia, it includes Eurasia. And is it really not in our interest to rebuild and reinforce those alliances in a case where the US really isn't our friend?
Great, thanks. Is there someone from this side? Might have neglected this side of the room. Yeah, sorry. Philip, can you go to the back there? And there's two, we'll take two people there, and we'll get some quick comments from the panel, then we'll have time to come out again, I think.
How can you imagine a European industrial policy without a coherent energy policy?
Yeah, nice point. There's a lady next to you, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to ask a question about the war. Everyone is talking about, but no one is talking really seriously how to end the war. Especially without any negotiation, we cannot end the war, but serious negotiation. Until when we can support some countries, but without any negotiation. We have experience to support Afghanistan 20 years, but at the end, we left them. So I'm afraid this will be the case for Ukraine, and how many bodies we want to see dead, and also the country should destroy. We should find a solution to end the war. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. Right, so we'll take a few responses. I'll do this in the other way around. Christoph, can I start with you, and I'll come this way instead. Potentially, you might especially want to pick up this question about energy.
Yeah, and there was one from Mr. there about
the deep state, Trump, and democracy.
Well, yeah, I think that what we can learn from Trump, Nicole will certainly explain us what we can learn from him. But what we will learn from this, from Trump 47, I think, is that we're in Europe alone. And we will have to deal with, those big problems, our energy independence, our military capabilities that have atrophied. We'll have to, maybe try to figure out if Germany is still part of the Western Alliance, or are Germans going their own way? Maybe they've been, doing this for quite some time. We just didn't realize. And we're going to have to figure out, is Europe as a global power, is it sustainable without a strong France to counterbalance Germany. So I would answer, that would be my answer. And coming to the energy question, I think that maybe our weakness is that that the energy policy in Europe was too coherent, you know, that we were imposing this German model of, you know, wind turbines and solar powers and whatnot, while neglecting the most greenest of them all, the most efficient of them all, nuclear power, right? And maybe it's time to make it a little bit less coherent, a little bit less German, and, you know, put all our chips on nuclear power.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Christoph. Nicola, yeah.
Okay.
No, we'll come back out. We'll come back out. Don't worry.
Okay. I'll start over here with the question with respect to the deep state. First of all, I was promised by Frank and Jacob that there would be no difficult question. Okay, so the flippant answer is, first step is we find a European Elon Musk to help us out. But the actual answer is a very difficult one to come across. I'm going to think out loud here for a bit. The greatest challenge is, first of all, the United States is a very united country, individual states with very little power, very little tradition of being different from each other, even though there are a lot of historical and cultural differences, especially when you go from north to south. Europe is a much more diverse place with actual, on paper, sovereign states. And that runs into the most difficult question when it comes to the Europe and its future, is how do we think as a common Europe, us Europeans, but retain our national interest? Viktor Orban has suggested that we follow the community of nations concept, which I agree with. But how do we do that without falling to the trap of becoming Brussels bureaucrats ourselves? And if we want to think in that collective nature. So that is that's a big look, it's a big overview at that question. The specifics, you're going to have to wait for a bit, unfortunately. Let me turn to Ukraine. I'm going to say this beyond objective. I'm going to take it very personally here because I'm Croatian, and we had a little bit of a war not too long ago ourselves. And the parallels between our war with Yugoslavia, which then became Rump Yugoslavia run by Serbia, and the war between Ukraine and Russia are many. That's pretty much the reason why 3/4 of Croatians reflexively support Ukraine in this war. The problem is this. Ukraine is not experiencing one war right now. It's experiencing two different wars simultaneously. The first one is the very obvious Russian aggression against Ukraine, in which Ukrainians are bravely fighting for their own territory, for their own sovereignty, for their own future, for which they should be applauded. But the larger conflict is the American one that's been launched against Russia since the end of the Cold War. And this is one in which the Ukrainians are unfortunately a proxy force. And to make it even worse, they are going to be hung out to dry. They're being bled. And because it's the Americans who have financed this, along with the Europeans in a secondary role, it's their goals which are going to take precedence when negotiations go underway. Excuse me. And okay, I'll wrap it up. Which means that you guys are getting sold out, and that makes me very sad because I grew up with a lot of Ukrainians in Canada, especially those from Lvov, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Anton, some thoughts?
Yeah. 2 points, 2 questions. Ending the war. Everyone wants to end the war. Ukraine wants to end the war the most, right? But it's a question of conditions on which they can end the war and to make sure that the war will not be restarted, because we had similar situation in 2014, 2015, when the Minsk agreements were brought, and then it was basically the time to prepare and continue. So we would like to avoid a similar situation. What we've seen so far by Joe Biden administration was a lack of strategy, because supporting Ukraine until it needs to be supported is not a strategy, it's a lack of strategy. So I do hope that the new administration has a clear plan, like peace through power or through force. It sounds like a plan. enforcing Russia and at the same time enforcing Ukraine to make some compromise sounds like a plan. So let's hope that they will succeed in this regard. How the conflict differ? Well, we are talking about nuclear missiles versus air defense. In Poland and Romania, Cuban nuclear crisis was about bringing nuclear missiles to Cuba. At the same time, in Europe, what we've seen in the last decades was, again, bringing Russian nuclear weapons closer to European borders. And we are not talking about it, we are talking about air defense systems brought to, NATO systems brought to Poland and Romania. But in beginning of 2000s, Russia brought nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad. That's currently one of the main threats to Germany and Poland, having nuclear weapons in Russian exclave, quite close. And at the same time, after United States and Russia quit the INF treaty about the short-range missiles, it's a real threat to Europe. And Russia brought nuclear weapons to Belarus, right? It happened last year. So Belarus, in 1993, gave up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in 1994. Kazakhstan did the same. And now they have nuclear weapons again. So I do see clear nuclear escalation in this regard. And at the same time, I don't see similar escalation in terms, in the same level escalation from the Western side. And I'm really happy that in the neighborhood, Poland and Romania has strong NATO presence, because it helps Hungary as well, right? We are a proud member of the NATO.
Great, thanks. Monica.
Very briefly, we discussed a lot of these things in a conference here in MCC year after the war broke out, I guess. And back then we also said, oh, everybody wants to finish the war. I don't think it is true, to be honest. But then also I can say I have views on this issue that put me as an enemy on both camps. Because from the fact that Russia is bad does not follow that Ukraine is good. So that's the first logical fallacy that I have here. But what I wanted to say is that we spent the whole day basically saying how Europe effectively is a vassal, hegemonic relationship to the US. So when we look at that war, we have to say that Ukraine is not a principal actor in that movie. And that's the first thing. And basically it serves as a glove that masks NATO fist. But that Europe does what America tells Europe to do doesn't also mean that Europe thinks coherently and unanimously about this war. That's all, I guess, that I wanted to say.
Good. Okay. Let's come. Are there any final points? Because I want a couple more points from the audience, but I also want to buy my panel some time, because to close, I'm going to ask you a slightly more difficult question, maybe, which is what in the European inheritance, or what in the kind of current makeup of European nation states do we have that we should kind of really focus on and look forward to if we're going to try and build some kind of sense of what Europe, or what the Europe of nations might be about. My hint, and maybe some of you might pick up on some of this, but my suggestion is that the thing that's historically driven European civilization forward has precisely been the creative tension between different nation states. And sometimes that's exploded in a very dangerous fashion, so we don't want to go too yeah, but we also, I think we have to look to ourselves. What's worked for Europe historically? What's the kind of foundation of European civilization, and what do we need to get back to? But I'll leave you to close this out with some more coherent thoughts. But just the last couple of points from the audience. Did I see a couple of hands? Yeah, okay, so we'll take 2 points, one there and one there, quick points, and then we'll hear some maybe more stirring words from our panel.
Yeah, just a final question. We've talked a lot about the West, or about Europe, but we haven't heard a lot about the rest. And it would interest me, just as someone who spends most of his time with Islam and also with Africa. So it's a bit, you mentioned Fukuyama with the end of history, and he neglected to note that the term comes from St. Augustine, and when the Germanic tribes invaded Rome and conquered Rome. But if you look at the archaeology of the Germanic tribes, they were never independent. You talk about ethnogenesis. They were kind of anti-Rome. And that's what I see with Russia, with Africa, with the Islamic world. They're not even with China, they're not really traditional societies with their own identity. They're, as we said with BRICS, they're an anti-Western. That's their basic, as Mr. Soldo said, that's their only raison d'etre, let us say. Do you see that different? Does anybody see that differently?
Great, not really nice point to end on. Yeah, and yourself?
Yes, I am Konrad Elst. I'm an Orientalist, and I follow closely the political discourse in both China and India. Now, in those two countries, since about 2012, the discourse is very abuzz with the notion of civilisational state, which they both call themselves. So I've heard some of you here call for European civilisational state. What do you mean exactly?
Great, thanks. Okay, so the last two questions allow me to give you maybe some more options, panel, but I'd like to hear what it is that we can look to kind of in European cultural history to build forward. But you also might want to pick out, if you want to disobey me, you can pick out maybe something from some of these challenger civilizations or something that we should either be worried about or learned about, but to round us off. Monica.
I can answer in 3 words. Would that make you happy? The good, the truth, the beautiful. This was what gave Europe the rise. If we can come back to this, and we can start with the beautiful, if we don't want to start with the truth and good, which are tricky. Seriously, nothing more, nothing less.
Thanks, yeah. And Anton?
Yeah, regarding the rest, I think maybe a bit differently. I think there are countries which are anti-Western by default, but most of those countries just want to be part of the West. They are not feeling themselves part of the West. They don't want to break the system. They want to be to have the place at the table. So I think that's and the West should see it clearly and make proper strategy. And unfortunately, Russia is playing on those sentiments like colonialism, anti-Western, and so on. But yeah, I think it's our responsibility to make proper strategy. Regarding your question, as I mentioned in my speech, the West was so we had some kind of a funeral against the West in the last decade, several times, in the last maybe centuries. The decadence of the West is declining. It's not something which we are talking about now. The people were talking about it in the 19th century and the 18th century, and then yet we are here and talking about Western dominance, Western hegemony, right? So I do think what makes the West different from other cultures is the ability to adapt, be flexible. And even if there are challenges, like clearly there are challenges right now in wokeism, and I don't want to go into that, but we have the power to see the challenges and to adapt.
Great, thanks, very good. Nick?
Yeah, I'll address the first question. Again, it might sound flippant, but it's a lack of vision and especially a lack of leadership that Europe is experiencing right now. My contribution to this, beyond what she said, and what she said was very, very brief, but it's very accurate, is that I myself left North America over a decade ago to return back home. And this is going to sound like grandiose, but the fact of the matter is, in my own way, it's a rejection of Anglo-liberalism and the hyper-individualism of their societies. And that's why I believe in Europe that we have a different approach with respect to a more communitarian way of organizing society, way of viewing ourselves. And the fact that we have all these nations with these amazing histories and these amazing cultures is, I think, the foundational building block upon a brighter European future, if I want to be political.
Cheers, Nick. Christoph?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, I have to admit. But I think that what we need is a higher tolerance for risk, which was at display, during the Greek times, and you see the conquistadors, Renaissance, our great inventors, Industrial Revolution. We are still the same people. We broadly have still the same culture, so we just have to, defeat this great conspiracy against our creative powers that is EU, and muddle through this time and get back to greatness.
Yes.
Can we thank the panel? Right. I also want to take the opportunity just to thank everyone who's attended, chipped in with questions and comments. As I said when I opened us up this morning, which feels like a lot longer ago because we've covered so much ground, but this is just the start. We at MCC Brussels are really interested in rethinking what Europe means for the 21st century, and to try and put some meat on the bones of some of the things we talked about: risk-taking, energy policy, industrial policy, military policy. All these kind of things are topics that we want to work on further. So we'd love to hear from you more if you've got ideas on how you'd like to take that forward, and maybe we can work together. But for now, last things to say are, do make sure you're following us on social media, especially on our YouTube and our Twitter, and make sure that you're signed up for our emails so you hear about the rest of our great events. You should have in your folder the news of our next couple of events, one talking about how we can reclaim the arts and culture from the DEI bureaucracy, and another one looking at the thorny question of migration and national borders. So lots more for us to discuss. But the second thing, and maybe the most important announcement of the day, is that we'll now go downstairs one floor. So take the lift down one floor to floor 26, where we'll have a drink and a chance to discuss a little bit further. And my colleagues, or maybe the hotel, but they've kind of made it very difficult for you not to join us for a drink, because they've actually moved the coat racks where you put your coats down to the 26th floor. So yeah, your bags are still where you left them, but you have little choice, I'm afraid, but to join us for a drink on the floor below. So we'll see you there, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good.
The drinks are also there.